Wyoming Territory, 1885. A land where mountains scraped the sky and valleys unfurled like green ribbons between rugged peaks. Here, in the shadow of the Tetons, men carved ranches from wilderness and battled nature's extremes with nothing but grit and determination. For women, this frontier offered little beyond harsh toil and isolation, unless they arrived with skills hardier than their Eastern upbringings had prepared them for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Margaret Harlow, a Philadelphia music teacher whose refined education and gentle manners led to her being abandoned at a remote stagecoach station before she could even meet the man who had sent for her. A woman, deemed too delicate for frontier life, left with nothing but a trunk of books and sheet music in a territory where survival demanded calloused hands and an iron will. Margaret stood alone on the weathered platform of Sweetwater Junction, her traveling dress, rumpled from 3 days of jolting stagecoach travel. The station consisted of little more than a squat log building, a corral, and a water pump. No town spread beyond it, only endless prairies stretching toward distant mountains. The station manager had already retreated inside, leaving her to the mercy of the relentless Wyoming wind that tugged at her hat and whipped dust against her skirts. She checked her watch for the 5th time in half an hour. According to the letter she clutched in her gloved hand, William Fletcher, her prospective husband, should have met her stagecoach. The letter had described him as a successful merchant in Pine Creek, a growing settlement 15 miles north. Their correspondence over 6 months had painted a picture of a respectable man seeking a cultured wife to help establish social refinement in a burgeoning frontier community. At 32, Margaret had long resigned herself to spinsterhood in Philadelphia. After her father's death left her with mounting debts and dwindling music students, the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer had seemed like divine intervention. Established businessman seeks educated lady of good character for matrimony in Wyoming Territory. Must appreciate culture and the development of society in a promising community. The letters that followed had been articulate and promising. William described his mercantile business, his standing in the community, and his vision for bringing Eastern refinement to Pine Creek. Margaret had sold her piano, her most prized possession, to finance the journey, convinced she was traveling towards security and purpose. "Ma'am?" The station manager stood in the doorway, cap in hand. "Stage won't be back until Tuesday next, 4 days from now." "I'm waiting for Mr. Fletcher," Margaret replied, maintaining her composure despite growing unease. "From Pine Creek. He was to meet me here." The man's weathered face revealed nothing, but his eyes held something. Was it pity? Might want to come inside then. "Got a bench by the stove." 3 more hours passed. Margaret refused refreshment, maintaining a rigid posture on the bench, as if proper deportment might somehow conjure William Fletcher's arrival. When the door finally opened again, her heart leapt, only to sink at the sight of a boy no more than 16. "You Miss Harlow?" he asked, twisting his hat in his hands. "Yes. Are you from Mr. Fletcher?" The boy nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "Got a message for you." He thrust a folded paper toward her before backing toward the door. Margaret's fingers trembled. As she unfolded the note, the handwriting matched the letters she'd received in Philadelphia, but the tone couldn't have been more different. "Miss Harlow, upon further consideration, I find our arrangement unsuitable. The stage company has instructions to return your fare to Philadelphia. With regrets, William Fletcher." The words blurred as Margaret stared at them. 6 months of correspondence, the sale of her piano, the journey across a continent, all dismissed in 2 terse sentences. "He ain't coming," the station manager said unnecessarily from behind the counter. It wasn't a question. "No," Margaret confirmed. her voice remarkably steady considering the hollowness spreading through her chest. "It seems not." Fletcher sent. "Word yesterday to hold your return fare," the man said. "Next eastbound stage isn't till Tuesday." 4 days. 4 days stranded at this desolate outpost with nothing but a trunk of possessions she'd carefully selected for her new life. "Is there accommodation here?" she asked, mentally calculating the remaining coins in her reticule. "Got a room, $1 a night, meals extra. $4 for lodging alone would consume nearly all her ready money." Margaret squared her shoulders. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Fletcher directly," she said. "Is there transportation available to Pine Creek?" The manager looked at her as if she'd suggested flying there. "Nothing till tomorrow when the mail wagon goes through. Cost you $2. And Mason likely won't wait while you have your conversation." "I see." Margaret folded the note precisely, tucking it into her pocket. "Then I shall require the room for tonight." She maintained her composure until the door closed behind her in the tiny spare room that held nothing but a narrow bed and a washstand. Only then did she permit herself to sink onto the edge of the mattress and press her handkerchief to her mouth, stifling the sound of her quiet weeping. Morning brought no solutions, only the harsh reality of her situation made clearer by daylight. Margaret had spent a restless night calculating options that dwindled with each reconsideration. She had insufficient funds to remain at the station until Tuesday, and even if she could, the return fare would only take her as far as Omaha. From there, she had no means to complete the journey to Philadelphia, where nothing awaited her but the creditors she'd fled. The mail wagon to Pine Creek represented her only chance to confront William Fletcher, to demand an explanation and possibly financial assistance for her return journey. She used precious water from the pitcher to wash her face, changed into her second-best traveling dress, and repinned her hair with shaking fingers. The station's common room held 3 men eating breakfast when she emerged. Their conversation ceased abruptly at her appearance. "Mail wagon leaves in 20 minutes, the manager informed her, sliding a plate of beans and salt pork across the counter. "That'll be 30 cents for breakfast," Margaret calculated again. $2 for the wagon, $4 already committed for 4 nights lodging she wouldn't use, 30 cents for breakfast. She would arrive in Pine Creek with precisely $2.70 remaining. "Is there somewhere in Pine Creek I might find accommodation?" she asked, forcing herself to eat despite her churning stomach. The meaningful glance exchanged between the men didn't escape her notice. "Harvey's boarding house takes ladies," one finally offered. $3. A week, meals included, just enough to survive until the next stage, if William Fletcher refused to assist her. Margaret nodded her thanks and continued eating in silence, preserving her dignity through sheer force of will. The mail wagon proved to be little more than a buckboard with worn springs. The driver, Mason, was a taciturn man who acknowledged her presence with a grunt before tossing her trunk in the back with surprising strength for his wiry frame. "Pine Creek's rough country for a lady alone," he commented as they jolted away from the station. "I won't be alone," Margaret replied automatically, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. "I have connections there." Mason's grunt suggested he knew better, but wouldn't contradict her. The 15-mile journey took over 3 hours on rutted tracks that barely deserved to be called roads. Margaret clung to the seat as the wagon bounced through dried creek beds and around rock outcroppings. The landscape unfolded in a harsh beauty that might have captivated her under different circumstances, sweeping vistas of prairie giving way to pine-covered foothills as they approached the mountains. Pine Creek itself appeared suddenly, nestled in a valley. Unlike the bustling settlement William had described, Margaret saw a single dirt street lined with perhaps 24 buildings, most constructed of rough-hewn logs. A few wore false fronts proclaiming their businesses. Johnson's General Merchandise, Pine Creek Hotel, Assay Office, Well Saloon, "Where's Fletcher's store?" she asked as they rumbled into town. Mason jerked his head toward a shuttered building near the end of the street. "Closed up 3 months back. Fletcher took off for Denver after the mine investment went bad." The revelation struck Margaret like a physical blow. 3 months. But she'd received a letter from him barely 6 weeks ago, detailing plans for her arrival, which meant he'd written to her, encouraging her journey when he'd already known. "Stop the wagon, please," she managed, her voice faint. Mason pulled the horses to a halt in front of a 2-story building with Harvey's boarding house painted on a wooden sign. The establishment at least existed as promised. Its whitewashed clapboards making it one of the more respectable-looking buildings on the street. "Miss Harlow?" Mason was watching her with undisguised concern. "You look poorly." "I'm quite all right," she assured him, though nothing could have been further from the truth. "Would you be so kind as to bring my trunk?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The proprietress of Harvey's boarding house was a stout woman of indeterminate age with sharp eyes and practical clothing. She assessed Margaret with a single glance that seemed to catalogue everything from the quality of her gloves to the desperation she was trying to conceal. "I'm Mrs. Harvey," she said without preamble. "Rooms, $3 a week, includes breakfast and supper. No gentlemen callers in private rooms, laundries extra." "Thank you," Margaret replied, extending payment for her first week before her courage could falter. "I'm Margaret Harlow." Mrs. Harvey's expression softened fractionally. "Fletcher's bride." It wasn't a question, and the confirmation that her situation was already known sent heat rising to Margaret's cheeks. "I was engaged to correspond with Mr. Fletcher," she acknowledged stiffly. "It seems circumstances have changed." Mrs. Harvey snorted. "That's one way to put it. Fletcher's been gone since May, left owing half the town money. Rooms upstairs. Second door on the right. Supper's at 6 sharp. With that blessing, Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to the small room that would be her temporary sanctuary. It held a single bed, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a hook on the wall for clothing, and a surprisingly lovely braided rug on the floor. The window overlooked the main street, where a few people moved between buildings in the afternoon sun. She sat on the edge of the bed, removed her gloves with deliberate care, and allowed herself 5 minutes by her watch to acknowledge the full magnitude of her situation. She was stranded in a remote mining town with less than $3 to her name, no prospects, and no way to return east. William Fletcher, if that was even his real name, had deliberately lured her across the country with false promises, perhaps seeing in her letters the same desperate hope she now recognized. In retrospect, when the 5 minutes elapsed, Margaret dried her eyes, smoothed her skirts, and made her first practical decision. She would seek employment. Her education must be worth something, even in this rough place. She had taught music in Philadelphia. Surely there must be parents in Pine Creek who desired education for their children. The town's single street revealed itself as both more and less than it had appeared from the wagon. More, in that behind several buildings stretched additional structures, stables, workshops, smaller dwellings. Less, in that many businesses clearly operated on the edge of survival, with handwritten signs advertising reduced prices and credit. No longer extended, Margaret walked its length with her head held high, ignoring curious stares from the few women she passed and the more direct appraisals from men lounging outside the saloon. Johnson's General Merchandise seemed the logical place to begin inquiries about the community. The store's interior was dimly lit, but meticulously organized, with goods ranging from mining supplies to fabric bolts arranged on shelves that reached the ceiling. A middle-aged man with spectacles looked up from his ledger as the bell above the door announced her entrance. "Good afternoon," Margaret began, summoning the poise that had served her through Philadelphia drawing rooms. "I'm Margaret Harlow, recently arrived from Philadelphia. I was hoping you might advise me about local families who might desire a music or general education teacher for their children. The storekeeper, Mr. Johnson himself, she presumed, studied her with undisguised curiosity. Miss Harlow, word travels fast in small places. You're the lady Fletcher sent for. Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. I was corresponding with Mr. Fletcher, yes. It seems he's no longer in Pine Creek. Left owing me $200, Johnson confirmed, though without apparent bitterness. Not the first to try his luck elsewhere when the silver seam played out. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret offered with genuine sympathy, but as I find myself temporarily in Pine Creek, I hope to offer my services as a teacher while I consider my options. Johnson's expression turned kind, which was somehow worse than curiosity had been. Miss Harlow, Pine Creek's not what it was a year ago. When the main mine closed, half the families pulled out. Those that stayed, he shook his head. Miners don't have cash for extras like music lessons. Most children here help their parents from the time they can walk. I see. Margaret maintained her composure through force of will. Perhaps there are other services I might offer. I'm accomplished in literature, mathematics, and correspondence. Miners' Exchange keeps the town books, Johnson replied. And the assay office handles most business correspondence. Truth is, Pine Creek's dying. Another year, it'll be a ghost town unless new silvers are found. The bell jangled again as the door opened, admitting a tall, weathered man whose presence seemed to fill the small space. He nodded to Johnson before noticing Margaret, his expression unchanging as he took in her obvious Eastern attire. Miss Harlow, this is Daniel Reed, Johnson said. Owns the Broken Pine Ranch north of town. Reed, Miss Harlow's, recently arrived from Philadelphia. Daniel Reed looked to be in his early 40s, with sun-creased skin and eyes the same gray as the mountains visible through the store window. His clothing was trail-worn but clean. Canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a battered hat he removed upon being introduced. Ma'am, he acknowledged with a slight nod before turning to Johnson. Need supplies? List here. He placed a paper on the counter, written in a surprisingly elegant hand. Mr. Reed's one of our few remaining customers who pays in cash. Johnson said with obvious approval, already gathering items from the list. His cattle operations, about the only business around here that hasn't suffered from the mine closure. Margaret seized the opening. Mr. Reed, do you perhaps have children who might benefit from education in music or literature? Reed's grey eyes assessed her briefly. No children. His deep voice carried a quality she couldn't immediately identify. Not unfriendly, but measured, as if words were precious commodities, not to be wasted. He turned his attention back to Johnson, who was tallying supplies. Sarah Tucker passed last night, Reed said quietly. Fever took her. Johnson's shoulders slumped. Lord rest her. What about the children? Neighbors took the boy, Reed replied. Girl's too small. No one can manage an infant with winter coming. Poor little mite, Johnson sighed. That's 5 orphans from fever this summer. Margaret listened to the exchange with growing horror. What will happen to the child? She asked before she could stop herself. Reed glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. Reverend Morris is looking for anyone willing to take her to Denver Orphanage, 30 miles south. The matter-of-fact statement struck Margaret as unbearably callous, though she recognized the harsh reality it represented. An infant required care these hard-scrabble people couldn't provide while fighting for their own survival. Surely someone in town could... she began. But Johnson was already shaking his head. Most families are barely feeding their own, he explained, gently, and single men can't raise a baby girl. The conversation shifted to other town matters as Johnson assembled Reed's supplies. Margaret stood forgotten, mentally revising her plans yet again. If Pine Creek offered no employment prospects, perhaps the next settlement might, but without funds for transportation, $23 even, Johnson announced, finishing his tally. Reed counted out the amount precisely, his movements. Economical. As he gathered his supplies into a canvas bag, he paused, seeming to come to some decision. "Miss Harlow," he said abruptly, "you looking for work?" Margaret blinked at the unexpected question. "Yes, I am." "Need someone at the ranch," Reed continued, his speech direct to the point of bluntness. "Housekeeper, cook, previous woman left last month. $5 weekly, room and board." The offer hung in the air between them. $5 weekly, more than she could hope to earn through teaching in this environment, enough to eventually finance her return east if she was frugal. Yet the prospect of isolated ranch life with this taciturn stranger raised obvious concerns. "Your ranch is far from town?" she asked carefully. 10 miles. Come to town monthly for supplies." Johnson intervened, perhaps sensing her hesitation. "Reed's place is respectable, Miss Harlow. He employs 3 hands who bunk in the outbuilding. Main house has proper locks. Sarah Miller kept a house there 5 years before she married." Still, Margaret hesitated, weighing desperate circumstances against legitimate concerns. "I should mention that my cooking skills are limited." The corner of Reed's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Can you read?" The non sequitur caught her off guard. "Of course. Kitchen has a book of receipts. Follow directions, should manage." Such practicality was difficult to argue with. Margaret considered her dwindling options and the $2 remaining in her reticule. "When would this position begin?" she asked. "Leaving tomorrow," Reed replied. "After the funeral, one more night at the boarding house, then a decision that would determine the course of her immediate future." Margaret took a steadying breath. "I'll give you my answer in the morning, Mr. Reed." He nodded once, accepting this as reasonable, and departed with his supplies. "He's a good man," Johnson said after the door closed. "Doesn't talk much since losing his wife and son to mountain fever 4 years back, but treats his people fair. You could do worse, especially now." Margaret spent a restless night weighing her options, finding each lacking in some critical aspect. Returning east was financially impossible. Remaining in Pine Creek offered no prospects for employment. Moving to another settlement required funds she didn't possess. Daniel Reed's offer, for all its uncertainties, provided immediate security and the possibility of future choice once she'd earned sufficient funds. His taciturn nature was concerning, yet both Johnson and Mrs. Harvey, whom she'd cautiously questioned over supper, vouched for his character. "Reed's solid," Mrs. Harvey had said emphatically. "Doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, pays his debts." Sarah Miller never had complaints about her treatment there. Morning found Margaret at the small church on the edge of town, observing Sarah Tucker's funeral from a respectful distance. The entire community seemed present, gathered around a simple pine coffin, while Reverend Morris spoke words of comfort. On the outskirts of the crowd stood Daniel Reed, his tall figure unmistakable. At the ceremony's conclusion, while townspeople offered condolences to a red-eyed man clutching a small boy's hand, Margaret approached Reed with her decision. "I accept your offer of employment, Mr. Reed," she said without preamble, "with the understanding that should the arrangement prove unsuitable for either party, proper notice will be given." Reed nodded once, his expression unchanged. Leaving. In 1 hour from the boarding house, Margaret returned to Harvey's to pack her few belongings, her mind racing between practical concerns and second thoughts. An hour later, she stood on the boardwalk with her trunk, watching Reed's wagon approach through a swirl of dust. As he helped load her trunk, Margaret noticed something unexpected on the wagon seat, a small wooden crate lined with blankets. Inside lay a red-faced infant, perhaps 3 months old, sleeping fitfully. "The Tucker baby," Reed explained, seeing her surprise. "No one to take her to Denver." "You're delivering her to the orphanage?" Margaret asked, a strange flutter of relief. Mingling with sorrow at the child's fate, Reed's grey eyes met hers directly for the first time. "No, taking her home." The simple statement, delivered without elaboration, shifted Margaret's understanding of this silent man. Before she could formulate a response, he handed her into the wagon seat beside the makeshift cradle. "Hope you know something about babies," he added, the barest hint of uncertainty cracking through his composed exterior. "Ranch is no place for a child without proper care." As the wagon pulled away from Pine Creek, Margaret Harlow found herself traveling toward an unknown future with a taciturn rancher and an orphaned infant, far from the life she had envisioned when stepping off the Philadelphia train 3 weeks earlier. Yet for the first time since reading William Fletcher's cruel note of rejection, she felt the faintest stirring of purpose beneath her uncertainty. The road ahead stretched across the Wyoming wilderness, carrying her toward the broken Pine Ranch and whatever awaited her there. The wagon rattled across increasingly rugged terrain as they left Pine Creek behind. Margaret balanced the wooden crate between them, instinctively steadying it when the wheels hit particularly deep ruts. The infant stirred occasionally, but remained mercifully quiet, exhausted from her ordeal. "Does she have a name?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. "Emma," Reed replied. "Emma Tucker." The mountains loomed closer now, pine forests stretching across foothills that gave way to rocky slopes dusted with early snow. September in Wyoming Territory brought crisp mornings and the first warnings of the brutal winter to come. "Have you cared for a child before, Mr. Reed?" Margaret ventured, trying to understand the stoic man beside her. A shadow passed across his weathered features. "Had a son, Thomas, died with his mother." The simple statement contained volumes of grief, delivered with such restraint that Margaret felt its weight more keenly than dramatic declarations might have conveyed. She offered no platitudes, sensing they would be unwelcome. "I taught children in Philadelphia," she said instead, "though none so young as Emma." Reed nodded, accepting this information without comment. The wagon crested a rise, revealing a sweeping valley nestled between mountain ridges. A creek bisected the landscape, its banks lined with cottonwoods showing the first gold of autumn. "Broken pine," Reed stated, gesturing toward the valley. As they descended, details emerged: fenced pastures where cattle grazed on late summer grass, outbuildings clustered near corrals, and at the center a substantial log home with a wide porch and stone chimney. Smoke curled from the chimney despite the afternoon warmth, suggesting someone awaited their return. "Mrs. Miller left last month?" Margaret asked, recalling Johnson's comments. "August. Married the blacksmith." Reed guided the horses around a bend in the track. "Been managing since." Margaret tried to imagine this solitary man attempting to maintain a household while running a cattle operation. Her Philadelphia sensibilities recoiled at the thought, even as she acknowledged the frontier necessity of such adaptations. "I should warn you that while I can manage basic cooking, my experience is primarily with Eastern dishes," she admitted, "and I've never cooked on a wood stove." For the first time, Reed's expression softened marginally. "Survived my cooking for weeks. Yours can't be worse." The unexpected touch of humor caught Margaret off guard. She found herself offering a small smile in return, the first since discovering William Fletcher's deception. As they approached the ranch buildings, Margaret noted the careful construction and maintenance: split-rail fences in good repair, a freshly shingled roof on what appeared to be a bunkhouse, whitewashed buildings arranged with practical efficiency. The main house was larger than she'd expected, constructed of substantial pine logs with proper glass windows rather than oiled paper. A middle-aged man emerged from a barn as they pulled into the yard, wiping his hands on a rag. His weathered face registered surprise at the sight of Margaret, quickly masked by a respectful nod. "Mr. Reed," he greeted, then glanced at the crate. "That's the Tucker baby?" Reed handed Margaret down from the wagon before replying. "Emma Tucker. She'll be staying." He made the announcement without preamble or explanation. If the man found anything unusual in this declaration, he showed no sign. "Ma'am," he acknowledged Margaret. "Frank Morgan, foreman." "Margaret Harlow," she replied, clinging to social conventions. That suddenly seemed absurdly inadequate for the situation. "I'll be assisting Mr. Reed with household matters." Morgan's gaze held no judgment, only practical assessment. "House has been needing a woman's touch since Sarah Miller left. Boys and I've been making do, but—" He shrugged expressively. Reed had already lifted her trunk from the wagon. "Frank, have Jimmy bring in firewood and water. Miss Harlow, I'll show you the house." The interior of the Broken Pine ranch house revealed both careful craftsmanship and masculine neglect. The main room held sturdy furniture built for utility rather than fashion. A pine table with mismatched chairs, a leather sofa facing the stone fireplace, bookshelves filled with an eclectic collection of volumes. Dust had accumulated on surfaces. Unwashed coffee cups cluttered a sideboard, and the braided rug needed a thorough beating. But the underlying structure spoke of solid comfort. "Kitchens through there." Reed indicated a doorway. "Pantries stocked. Bedrooms upstairs. Yours is." "First on right. My room's at end of the hall. Washrooms off kitchen with pump inside. Privy's out back." Emma chose that moment to wake fully, her tiny face crumpling as she drew breath for what promised to be a substantial wail. Reed looked momentarily stricken, his composure faltering. Margaret instinctively lifted the infant, cradling her against her shoulder as she had seen mothers do. "She's probably hungry," she observed, though her practical knowledge of infant care was embarrassingly limited. "Did the neighbors send anything for her? Milk?" Reed gestured to a canvas bag beside the door. "Mrs. Wilson provided supplies. Said she needs goat's milk, watered down, and clean clothes." The baby's cries escalated, tiny fists waving in protest against circumstances she couldn't possibly comprehend. Margaret patted her back awkwardly, feeling hopelessly inadequate for the task but unwilling to show weakness on her first hour at Broken Pine. "I'll prepare her milk," she decided, "if you'll show me the kitchen." The kitchen proved more organized than the main room, with a massive wood stove dominating one wall, its surface cleared for use. Shelves held practical crockery, cast iron. Cookware hung from hooks, and a scrubbed pinework table occupied the center of the space. A door led to a well-stocked pantry, where smoked meats hung alongside sacks of flour, sugar, and dried beans. Reed located a bottle and rubber nipple among Mrs. Wilson's supplies, along with a small crock of fresh goat's milk. Margaret set about, preparing the formula according to the hasty instructions scrawled on a scrap of paper, acutely aware of Reed watching her every move, while Emma continued to cry. "Perhaps you could bring my trunk upstairs while I tend to her?" Margaret suggested, needing a moment to collect herself without his silent observation. Reed nodded and departed, his footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs. Left alone with the crying infant, Margaret murmured reassurances she didn't feel, struggling to warm the milk without overheating it while supporting Emma awkwardly with one arm. "We're both strangers here, aren't we?" she whispered to the red-faced baby. "Both of us were thrown into circumstances we never expected." Emma's only response was continued wailing, growing more desperate by the moment. When the milk seemed sufficiently warmed, Margaret settled onto a kitchen chair and adjusted the infant in her arms, offering the bottle with trepidation. After initial confusion, Emma latched onto the rubber nipple with surprising ferocity. The sudden silence felt miraculous. Margaret exhaled slowly, watching the tiny girl's face relax as she drank, dark lashes resting against flushed cheeks. Something shifted in Margaret's chest, not the immediate formation of maternal affection, but perhaps the first recognition of shared vulnerability. "You're managing." Reed's voice came from the doorway, where he stood watching them with an unreadable expression. For the moment, Margaret acknowledged, though I should tell you that I have very little practical experience with infants. My knowledge is largely theoretical. Reed leaned against the doorframe, his tall frame filling the space. Same here. Had help with Thomas when he was small. This frank admission of inadequacy somehow eased Margaret's anxiety. They were both navigating unfamiliar waters with this orphaned child. We'll need proper baby things, she said, shifting to practical matters. A cradle, more cloths for diapers, proper baby clothes. Can make a cradle, Reed offered. Got tools. Wilson sent some baby gowns in the bag. And we'll need to establish a schedule, Margaret continued, her organizational instincts asserting themselves. Regular feedings, proper washing arrangements. The winter is coming, so we must ensure adequate warmth. For a moment, she thought she detected something like approval in Reed's grey eyes. Got time now to see the rest of the house? He asked, as Emma's eyes drifted closed, milk forgotten. Margaret carefully adjusted the sleeping infant against her shoulder. Yes, I believe so. The tour revealed a home larger and more refined than its exterior suggested. Beyond the main room and kitchen lay a small study with a desk and additional bookshelves. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms branched off a central hallway, the first designated as hers, simply furnished with a bed, chest of drawers, washstand, and small writing desk beneath a window overlooking the valley. This was the bedroom Mrs. Miller used, Margaret asked, noting the faded floral curtains that suggested a feminine touch. Reed shook his head. She slept downstairs. This was my wife's room. The admission startled her. Mr. Reed, I couldn't possibly. Ellen would have wanted it used, he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Room's been closed up 4 years, needs life in it. Before Margaret could formulate a response, Emma stirred against her shoulder. With a small whimper, Reed's attention immediately shifted to the infant. She needs changing, Margaret said, recognizing the particular discomfort in the baby's movements. And I'll need to prepare dinner soon. Your men will be expecting it? At 6, simple fare's fine. Just ring the bell outside the kitchen door when it's ready. With that, Reed left her to settle in, his boots echoing on the stairs as he descended. Margaret stood in the center of the room that had belonged to Ellen Reed, the infant a warm weight against her shoulder, and felt the enormity of her situation wash over her. 24 hours ago, she had been abandoned at a stagecoach station. Now she was housekeeper to a taciturn rancher and makeshift caretaker to an orphaned infant. The practicalities of her situation left little time for contemplation. After changing, Emma using cloths from Mrs. Wilson's supplies, Margaret fashioned a temporary bed from a dresser drawer lined with blankets. She unpacked her trunk, hanging her limited wardrobe in the small closet and arranging her few personal possessions, books, writing materials, a daguerreotype of her parents, the sheet music she'd brought with such hope, on the dresser and writing desk. The kitchen proved a more immediate challenge. Margaret had cooked simple meals in Philadelphia, but the massive wood stove, with its various dampers and temperature zones, presented a formidable learning curve. The book of receipts Reed had mentioned turned out to be a handwritten journal, filled with practical instructions. Biscuits need the hottest part of oven. Banking coals keeps beans cooking overnight. Sourdough starter needs feeding weekly. Margaret recognized the elegant hand from the supply list Reed had presented to Johnson. This must be Ellen Reed's cookbook, maintained and used by the housekeeper who followed her. The thought was strangely intimate. Touching pages written by the woman whose room she now occupied, whose place in the household she was attempting to fill in the most practical sense. She selected a simple recipe for beef stew, relieved to find it required minimal technique beyond chopping vegetables and allowing time for the meat to tenderize. As the stew simmered, filling the kitchen with savory aromas, Margaret mixed biscuit dough according to Ellen Reed's precise instructions, checking on Emma frequently as she slept in her makeshift cradle on the kitchen table. The ranch bell outside. The kitchen door proved heavier than expected, requiring genuine effort to ring. Within minutes, 4 men appeared at the back door, Reed, Morgan, and 2 younger cowboys, who removed their hats and introduced themselves as Jimmy Turner and Will Cooper. Dinner proceeded with surprising smoothness. The men ate appreciatively, making no mention of the slightly scorched bottoms of the biscuits or the overcooked carrots in the stew. Conversation remained largely practical. Reports on cattle movement, fence repairs, preparations for winter, with occasional updates directed to Reed for approval or decision. Margaret observed the interactions with interest, noting the obvious. Respect the men held for their employer, despite or perhaps because of his taciturn nature. Reed spoke only when necessary, his comments direct and thoughtful, his decisions rendered without preamble or unnecessary explanation. Emma woke halfway through the meal, her plaintive cries audible from the kitchen. Margaret excused herself to tend to the infant, returning with the baby cradled awkwardly in one arm while she attempted to finish her own dinner one-handed. "Ma'am, if you don't mind." Frank Morgan extended his arms with surprising gentleness. "I raised 4 of my own before my Martha passed. Still remember how it's done." Margaret relinquished Emma gratefully, watching in amazement as the weathered foreman cradled the infant with practiced ease, murmuring nonsense in a soft voice that contrasted sharply with his rugged appearance. "Frank's youngest is 16 now," Reed explained, noticing her surprise. "Works over at the Thompson place." "Good boys, all 4, Morgan said proudly. "Martha would have wanted a girl, though. This little one reminds me of my Sadie when she was small." The moment of shared humanity, these rough men revealing unexpected tenderness toward an orphaned infant, shifted something in Margaret's perception of Broken Pine. What had seemed a harsh masculine environment hostile to feminine influence revealed itself as something more complex, a place where practical necessity coexisted with genuine care, where a taciturn rancher would bring home an orphan rather than consign her to an uncertain fate, where a weathered foreman would cradle a baby with practiced hands. After the men departed for the bunkhouse, Margaret completed kitchen cleanup, while Reed sat at the table, awkwardly holding Emma. His large hands seemed terrified of crushing her small form, yet he refused to relinquish her to the makeshift cradle, watching her with an intensity that spoke volumes. "You're certain about keeping her?" Margaret ventured, drying the last plate. "It won't be easy, especially through winter." Reed's expression remained unchanged, but something in his posture suggested absolute resolve. "Orphanage in Denver has 50 children, not enough staff, not enough food. Emma stays here." The declaration left no room for debate. Margaret nodded, accepting his decision while mentally cataloguing all they would need to properly care for an infant through the coming months. "We'll need to establish sleeping arrangements for her," she said practically. "The drawer will suffice temporarily, but she'll need a proper cradle and eventually a crib." "I'll start on it tomorrow," Reed promised. "Can use pine from the north." "Grove?" Margaret hesitated before her next question. "And where should her cradle be placed? In your room, or—" The implication hung awkwardly between them. Reed frowned slightly, considering. "Your room, if you're willing," he finally said. "Mine's furthest from stairs. Wouldn't hear her at night." The arrangement made practical sense, yet represented a significant responsibility, one Margaret wasn't entirely confident in her ability to fulfill. Still, the alternative was unthinkable. She couldn't imagine this solitary man managing nighttime, feedings and changings, while also running a cattle ranch. "That seems sensible," she agreed, "though I should warn you that neither of us may get much sleep for a while." Reed's mouth quirked in what might have been an almost smile. "Been short on sleep since Sarah Miller left. At least now there's a reason for it. That night, after Reed reluctantly retreated to his own room, Margaret prepared for her first night at Broken Pine. She washed at the basin, changed into her nightdress, and checked Emma's drawer bed one final time before climbing beneath, surprisingly, fine quilts that smelled faintly of lavender sachets. The silence of the ranch enveloped her, not the true silence of absence, but the living quiet of wind through pine trees, distant cattle lowing, the occasional creak of the house settling. So different from Philadelphia's constant urban hum, yet strangely comforting in its authenticity. Tomorrow would bring a new routine, challenges she couldn't yet anticipate, the beginning of whatever life she might build from the ruins of William Fletcher's deception. As Emma's soft breathing filled the darkened room, Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge both her terror and her determination. She was alone in the Wyoming wilderness with a man she barely knew and an infant who depended entirely on their inadequate care. Yet for the first time since reading Fletcher's cruel dismissal, she felt the stirring of something like purpose. Not the secure future she had traveled west to find, but perhaps something more immediate and vital. As sleep claimed her, Margaret's last coherent thought was that while the Broken Pine Ranch might not be the life she had chosen, it offered what Philadelphia no longer could, the chance to be genuinely needed. Dawn at Broken Pine arrived with golden light spilling through eastern windows and Emma's hungry cries shattering the pre-dawn quiet. Margaret woke, disoriented, momentarily, forgetting where she was until the infant's wails brought reality rushing back. She lifted Emma from her drawbed, murmuring soothing nonsense while navigating the unfamiliar room in half-darkness. The house was silent as Margaret descended the stairs. Emma clutched against her shoulder. In the kitchen, embers still glowed. In the wood stove, needing only kindling to revive the fire, she managed this one-handed, a small victory that bolstered her confidence as she prepared the infant's milk. "You're up early." Reed's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway already dressed for the day in work clothes, his dark hair damp from washing. Emma was hungry, Margaret explained unnecessarily as the baby grabbed eagerly at the bottle. Reed nodded, moving to the stove where coffee already percolated in a blue enamel pot. "Men start at sunrise. Breakfast at 5:30 most days." The statement wasn't delivered as a demand, merely information, but Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment at having failed this first expectation. "I'll be prepared tomorrow," she promised. "I'm still learning the rhythms here." "No hurry today," Reed replied, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Frank's handling morning chores. Thought I'd start on the cradle." He placed 1 mug on the table near Margaret, before retreating to the back porch with his own. Through the window, she watched him split kindling with precise, powerful strokes that spoke of long practice. The unspoken accommodation, allowing her time to adjust rather than demanding immediate adherence to ranch schedules, touched her more deeply than effusive welcomes might have. By the time Emma finished her bottle, Margaret had located eggs, salt pork, and flour for a simple breakfast. Reed returned as she was frying slices of salt pork in a cast-iron skillet, the kitchen filling with the homely scent of cooking. "Found Ellen's old work basket," he said, placing a wicker container on the table. "Might have baby things in it. She was making items before." The hesitation in his voice revealed the painful territory they were approaching. Margaret accepted the basket with appropriate solemnity, recognizing it as both a practical offering and significant gesture. "Thank you," she said simply. "This will be very helpful." Inside lay neatly folded squares of soft flannel, partially, completed baby gowns, a tiny crocheted blanket, and various sewing notions. Items prepared by Ellen Reed for the child who would never use them, now offered for an orphaned infant who had no mother to create such things. Reed retreated to the workshop attached to the barn after breakfast, leaving Margaret to establish her domain within the household. She spent the morning exploring the house properly, taking inventory of supplies while carrying Emma from room to room in an improvised sling fashioned from a shawl. The Broken Pine Ranch house revealed itself as a curious blend of frontier practicality and unexpected refinement. The main room housed not only utilitarian furniture, but also a small upright piano positioned near the stone fireplace. Bookshelves contained volumes ranging from agricultural manuals to leather-bound collections of Shakespeare and Dickens. A roll-top desk in the study held meticulous ranch records written in the same elegant hand as the cookbook, Ellen Reed's, Margaret presumed. Upstairs, the room at the end of the hall, Reed's bedroom, remained a mystery, its door closed. The other bedrooms stood empty, save for basic furniture covered in dust cloths, awaiting guests who never arrived or children who had never been born. The room Margaret occupied bore subtle touches of femininity, curtains with embroidered edges, a braided rug in soft colors, a small painting of eastern woodlands that seemed startlingly out of place in this Western territory. The most immediately pressing issues emerged in the kitchen and pantry. While well stocked with staples, the organization had clearly suffered under bachelor management. Flour containers held coffee beans, sugar had been stored next to kerosene, and cooking implements lay scattered without apparent system. Margaret set about imposing order, creating designated spaces for baking supplies, breakfast items, and dinner ingredients. Emma proved a surprisingly accommodating companion, sleeping contentedly in her sling between feedings. By midday, Margaret had reorganized the pantry, planned meals for the coming week, and compiled a list of necessary items that the ranch appeared to lack: proper soap for baby laundry, additional cloths for diapers, yeast for bread making. The noon meal at Broken Pine was typically cold fare, taken in the fields, according to Ellen's cookbook notes, with only Reed returning to the house briefly. He appeared at the kitchen door. As Margaret was preparing a simple lunch of bread and cheese for herself, cradles taking shape, he reported, accepting the plate she offered. Should be ready by tonight. Already? Margaret couldn't hide her surprise. That seems remarkably quick. Reed's expression remained impassive, but something like pride flickered in his grey eyes. Been planning it in my head since yesterday. Just needed to put the saw to wood. He ate quickly, standing by the window rather than sitting at the table, his gaze periodically scanning the ranch yard and pastures beyond, a man accustomed to constant vigilance over his domain. Need anything from town? He asked as he finished. Frank's riding in tomorrow for mail. Margaret produced her list, explaining each item's necessity with the care of someone uncertain of her authority to request expenditures. Reed glanced over it without comment before folding it into his shirt pocket. Frank will get what's available, he said simply. Might need to order some items. Winter shipments get delayed. The matter-of-fact acceptance of her household requirements, without questioning or challenging her judgment, provided another small measure of reassurance. Whatever Daniel Reed's personal feelings about having a stranger manage his household and care for an orphaned infant he'd unexpectedly adopted, he was apparently committed to providing the necessary support for both responsibilities. The afternoon passed in continued organization and familiarization with the kitchen's peculiarities. Margaret discovered that the oven heated unevenly, requiring careful rotation of baking pans, that the pump handle needed jiggling to produce a steady stream rather than a reluctant trickle, that the back pantry remained surprisingly cool even on warm days, making it ideal for storing perishables. By the time she began dinner preparations, venison stew with dumplings according to Ellen's recipe, Margaret felt tentatively more confident in her ability to manage at least the cooking portion of her duties. The laundry, cleaning and baby care remained more daunting prospects, but she approached each challenge methodically, breaking insurmountable tasks into manageable components. The ranch hands received the evening meal with undisguised enthusiasm, particularly the dumplings that had puffed perfectly atop the rich stew. Even Reed offered a nod of approval as he accepted a second helping, a gesture Margaret was beginning to recognize as high praise from this taciturn man. After dinner, Reed disappeared into his workshop again, returning at dusk with his promised creation. The cradle revealed craftsmanship that surpassed Margaret's expectations: smooth pine, constructed with dovetail joints rather than nails, a gently curved hood at one end, rockers that allowed gentle movement, and around the base, delicately carved pine branches that gave the piece unexpected beauty. "It's magnificent," Margaret said honestly, running her fingers over the polished wood. "Far finer than anything I expected." Reed's expression remained stoic, but something in his posture eased at her praise. "Need to make a proper mattress. Used pine shavings and muslin for now. Ellen's work basket had baby sheets that should fit." The cradle was positioned beside Margaret's bed that night, Emma settling into it with apparent approval of her improved accommodations. As Margaret prepared for sleep, she found herself reflecting on the curious household she had entered. A silent rancher who carved delicate designs on a baby's cradle, weathered cowboys who cradled an infant with practiced hands, and an Eastern music teacher attempting to manage it all with inadequate preparation but determined resolve. The days that followed established a rhythm unlike anything Margaret had experienced in Philadelphia. She rose before dawn to kindle the fire and prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, fed and changed Emma, managed household tasks during morning hours, prepared dinner in late afternoon, and spent evenings attending to the baby's needs while completing mending or other seated work. Reed himself remained an enigma, present yet distant, involved yet separate. He took meals with Margaret rather than the hands, sitting at the kitchen table with ledgers or agricultural journals while she cooked, occasionally offering observations about ranch operations or weather expectations. Each evening he spent time with Emma, holding her with increasing confidence while Margaret completed kitchen cleanup, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he spoke to the infant in low tones Margaret couldn't quite hear. Frank Morgan returned from town with most items from Margaret's list and news that rippled through the small ranch community. Stage brought word that Pine Creek Mine might reopen, he reported over dinner. Eastern Company bought claims from the bank, sending engineers to assess. Reed received this information with characteristic reserve. Many promises over the years. A few pan out. This outfit seems different, Morgan countered. Already hired Jackson and Miller to repair equipment, paying cash wages. William Fletcher claimed to own a mercantile in Pine Creek, Margaret observed, the name still bitter on her tongue. Was there ever such an establishment? Morgan and Reed exchanged glances before the foreman answered. Fletcher ran a small supply store when the mine was operating. Fancy talker, that one, always promoting schemes and investments, left owing half the territory money when the silver ran out. The confirmation of Fletcher's duplicity, that he had indeed existed but departed long before writing to encourage. Her journey west rekindled Margaret's humiliation. The man had deliberately lured her across the continent with no intention of honoring his promises, perhaps seeing in her letters the desperate hope that had made her vulnerable to such deception. Folks in town asked after you, Morgan added, changing the subject with obvious intent. Reverend Morris was particularly interested to hear about Emma's welfare. I should write to him, Margaret decided. He may have information about her. Family circumstances that could prove important as she grows. Reed nodded approval. Good thinking. Morris knows most family connections hereabouts. That evening, after Emma was settled in her cradle, Margaret composed a careful letter to Reverend Morris, inquiring about Emma's parentage, potential relatives, and any details that might someday answer the questions the child would inevitably ask. As she wrote at the small desk beneath her window, movements in the yard below caught her attention. Reed stood near the corral, his tall figure silvered by moonlight as he spoke with a mounted rider. The conversation appeared intense, with uncharacteristic gestures from Reed suggesting disagreement. The rider eventually departed, leaving Reed standing motionless for long minutes before returning to the house. Margaret heard his heavy tread on the stairs, the careful closing of his bedroom door. Whatever news the night rider had delivered, Reed had chosen not to share it. The mystery was solved at breakfast, when Reed announced abruptly, "Riding to Fort Laramie today. Military supply contract need negotiation." "Fort Laramie," Margaret echoed. "Isn't that several days' journey?" "3 days each way, weather holding," Reed confirmed. "Frank manages while I'm gone. Jimmy stays at house nights for security." The arrangement was clearly established routine, yet Margaret felt unexpected concern at the prospect of Reed's extended absence. He had remained a remote figure during her week at Broken Pine, yet his solid presence provided a foundation for her tentative adaptation to ranch life. "Is there anything you need me to manage in your absence?" she asked, falling back on practicality. To mask her unease. "Correspondence or accounts?" Reed considered this briefly. "Ellen handled correspondence when I traveled. Letters might arrive needing response. Desk has supplies." The simple statement conveyed significant trust, granting Margaret access to his business affairs and the authority to act in his absence. She accepted this responsibility with appropriate gravity, recognizing it as another step toward establishing her place within the household. Reed departed after breakfast, his saddlebags packed with provisions and documents for the military negotiations. Margaret watched from the porch as he rode away, Emma cradled against her shoulder, the mountains rising stark and magnificent beyond his retreating figure. With Reed's absence, the routine at Broken Pine shifted subtly. Frank Morgan took meals at the house rather than the bunkhouse, updating Margaret on ranch operations and weather conditions each evening. Jimmy Turner, a lanky cowboy barely out of his teens, appeared at dusk to sleep in the small bedroom across. From hers, his presence a reassuring guarantee of security that Margaret hadn't realized she would appreciate. Emma thrived under Margaret's increasingly confident care. The tiny girl gained weight, her newborn fragility yielding to infant robustness as she settled into regular feeding and sleeping patterns. Margaret discovered unexpected pleasure in the baby's developing awareness, the way her dark eyes tracked movement, her tiny hands clutching at Margaret's fingers, the first hints of what might someday become a smile. On the third evening of Reed's absence, as Margaret sat by the fire with mending, while Frank Morgan entertained Emma with exaggerated facial expressions, she realized she felt something foreign to her experience of the past months. Contentment. Not happiness precisely, but a sense of purposeful belonging that had eluded her in Philadelphia after her father's death. "You're good with her," Morgan observed, nodding toward Emma, who had fallen asleep in the cradle he rocked gently with one foot. "Some women don't take to mothering natural-like, but you seem to have the knack despite being new to it." Margaret looked up from her mending, surprised by the observation. "I've never considered myself particularly maternal. In Philadelphia, I taught music to older children primarily. Babies were theoretical creatures in my experience." Morgan chuckled softly. "Theory and practice rarely match up, my Martha used to say, but some folks adapt better than others. You're managing fine for someone who never expected to be raising a child in Wyoming territory." The simple validation from this weathered man with 4 grown children carried unexpected weight. Margaret had been measuring herself against an impossible standard, the mythical frontier woman who supposedly managed household, children, and hardship with effortless competence. Morgan's approval suggested her genuine efforts, however imperfect, were sufficient by more realistic measures. "Mr. Reed seems quite attached to her already." Margaret observed, testing the waters of personal conversation with the foreman who knew Reed best. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. Loss marks a man. Some turn hard all the way through. Others just grow a shell to protect what's still tender inside. Reed's the second kind, though most folks only see the shell. The astute assessment aligned with Margaret's emerging understanding of her employer. Reed's taciturn nature concealed depths she had only glimpsed. In the careful carving of a baby's cradle, in his refusal to send an orphaned infant to an impersonal institution, in the books of poetry shelved alongside agricultural manuals. What was she like? Margaret asked softly. Ellen Reed. Morgan's weathered face softened with memory. Quiet, like him, but with a way of making folks feel welcome without many words. Eastern girl like yourself. Came west with her brother after their parents died. Met Reed when he was still foreman at the Mitchell spread. Folks said they recognized something in each other right off. Both carried themselves like people who'd seen hardship and come through it. The description stirred something in Margaret, not jealousy of a long-dead woman, but curiosity about the life Ellen Reed had built in this remote place before tragedy struck. Had she too experienced moments of doubt and inadequacy? Had she struggled with the Woodstove's temperamental nature and the endless demands of ranch life? The cookbook's precise instructions suggested a methodical woman who had mastered frontier challenges through careful observation and practice, an approach Margaret found herself emulating. The piano in the main room, was it hers? Margaret asked, having wondered about the instrument since discovering it. Morgan nodded. Reed had it brought by wagon from Denver. Took 8 men to get it up the mountain trails. Ellen played evenings, especially winters when dark came early. House hasn't had music since she passed. The revelation settled something in Margaret's mind. A tentative idea she had been considering but hesitated to implement without understanding its potential impact. The piano represented not just Ellen's presence, but a specific aspect of life, that broken pine that had been silenced by loss. Reviving that music might be perceived as intrusion, or possibly as the restoration of something valued. That night, after Morgan returned to the bunkhouse and Jimmy Turner retired to his room across the hall, Margaret sat beside Emma's cradle in the quiet darkness. Reed would return within days, resuming his rightful place as master of Broken Pine. Decisions about Emma's future, about Margaret's role within the household, about the shape of their unusual arrangement, would eventually require discussion. For now, however, Margaret found herself increasingly settled into the rhythm of ranch life, not with the security she had sought in William Fletcher's false promises, but with a more tenuous yet genuine belonging. She had not chosen Broken Pine, but perhaps, in ways she hadn't anticipated, it was choosing her. The day of Reed's expected return brought unseasonable warmth to the Wyoming Valley. Margaret completed morning chores with efficiency, born of growing familiarity, then carried Emma to the front porch, where she could watch the trail while enjoying the mild autumn sunshine. The baby, now more alert with each passing day, gazed at the golden cottonwood leaves with evident fascination. He should be back by sundown, Frank Morgan observed, pausing on his way to the north pasture, unless he stopped in Pine Creek for supplies. Margaret nodded, trying to mask her anticipation. Reed's absence had confirmed something she hadn't fully acknowledged. Her security at Broken Pine depended entirely on his continued approval of her services. Without formal agreements or familial connections, her position remained tenuous despite the growing comfort she felt within the household. "I've prepared a proper dinner," she said, striving for a casual tone. "Venison roast with the vegetables, from Ellen's garden." Morgan's eyes crinkled with knowing amusement. "Reed won't expect fancy cooking. Man survived on jerky and hardtack for 3 years during the war." This casual mention of Reed's military service, previously unknown to Margaret, underscored how little she knew about the man whose household she managed. Their conversations had remained largely practical, focused on immediate needs rather than personal histories. The war, she prompted, seizing the opportunity to learn more. Union cavalry, Morgan confirmed, served under Sheridan, doesn't speak of it much, but carries the memories. Most men do. The revelation added another layer to Margaret's evolving understanding of Daniel Reed, a Union veteran who had sought new beginnings in the Western Territories, only to face personal tragedy after building a life at Broken Pine. As morning stretched toward afternoon with no sign of Reed's return, Margaret decided to attempt something she had been considering since her conversation with Morgan days earlier. After settling Emma for her nap in the cradle downstairs, she approached the piano in the main room with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The instrument appeared well-maintained despite disuse, its walnut case polished and keys free of dust. Margaret lifted the fallboard gently, revealing ivory keys yellowed with age but intact. She pressed middle C tentatively, wincing at the expected dissonance of an untuned instrument. To her surprise, the note rang true. She tried a simple chord progression, finding the piano remarkably well-tuned despite years of silence. Someone had maintained it. Reed himself, perhaps, preserving this connection to his wife despite being unable to play himself. With growing confidence, Margaret began a simple Mozart sonata from memory. Her fingers felt stiff at first, unpracticed after weeks without playing, but muscle memory gradually returned. The melody filled the ranch house with gentle sound, breaking the silence that had prevailed in Reed's absence. So absorbed was she in the music that she didn't immediately notice Emma's silence. The baby, who had been fussing intermittently in her cradle, now lay quietly attentive, her dark eyes fixed on Margaret as the music continued. "She likes it," came a deep voice from the doorway. Margaret startled, her hands falling from the keys. As she turned to find Reed standing just inside the door, trail dust still clinging to his clothing, his expression unreadable as always, but somehow less guarded than usual. "Mr. Reed," she acknowledged, flustered by his unexpected appearance. "I didn't hear you return." "Just arrived." He moved into the room, his gaze shifting between Margaret and Emma. "Music carries down the valley. Heard it from the ridge trail." Uncertainty flooded her. "I apologize if I've overstepped. I know the piano was Ellen's." "No apology needed," Reed interrupted, his voice carrying an unusual softness. "House has been too quiet." The simple statement contained volumes, acknowledgement of loss, permission to continue, perhaps even appreciation. Margaret's hands returned to the keys, more tentatively now, with Reed as a conscious audience. "Did you play often in Philadelphia?" he asked, settling into a chair near Emma's cradle, his large hand automatically reaching to rock it gently. "I taught piano," Margaret replied, surprised by this initiation of personal conversation. "It was my livelihood after my father died." Reed nodded, something like understanding flickering in his grey eyes. "Ellen taught school before coming west, said music was her favorite subject to share with students." The parallel wasn't lost on Margaret. She ventured a more personal question than she had previously dared. "How long were you married?" 6 years. Reed's gaze remained on Emma, but his attention seemed focused on distant memories. "Not enough time, but more than some get." The simple philosophy struck Margaret as profoundly characteristic of this taciturn man, acknowledging loss without self-pity, recognizing fortune amid tragedy. In his own way, Reed had made peace with his circumstances while honoring what had been lost. "Did your business at Fort Laramie conclude successfully?" she asked, shifting to safer ground. "Army renewed the beef contract, higher price than last year. Inflation's hitting military supplies." This practical news carried significant implications for Broken Pine's financial security through the coming year. Margaret recognized it as a trust offering, Reed sharing business matters as he might with someone whose place in the household was established rather than provisional. "That's excellent news," she said sincerely. "I've been reviewing the pantry stores and we'll need substantial provisions before winter truly sets in." "Made a list?" Reed asked, his practical nature asserting itself. Margaret nodded, having compiled a detailed inventory during his absence. "And I've taken the liberty of organizing the household accounts." The system needed some refinement for clarity. For the first time in their acquaintance, something like genuine amusement crossed Reed's face. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. "Ellen said the same when she first arrived. Reorganized everything within a week." The comparison might have unsettled Margaret earlier, but now it felt like recognition rather than comparison. She found herself smiling in return. "Great minds approach problems similarly, I suppose." Emma chose that moment to declare her hunger with increasingly insistent cries. Margaret moved to lift her, but Reed was already there, cradling the infant. With growing confidence, "I'll tend her while you finish playing," he offered. "Been a long time since there was music at Broken Pine." The request carried more significance than its simple words suggested. Reed wasn't merely being polite. He genuinely wanted the music to continue, wanted this element of his previous life to return to his home. Margaret returned to the piano, selecting a gentle Chopin nocturne that filled the gathering dusk with melancholy beauty. As she played, she observed Reed with Emma, his weathered hands careful with her tiny form, his voice a low murmur as he explained military supply contracts to an infant with complete seriousness. The incongruous sight stirred something unexpected in Margaret's chest. Not just appreciation for his genuine care of the orphaned child, but awareness of the man himself, his capacity for tenderness beneath the stoic exterior. Supper that evening marked a subtle shift in the household dynamic. Reed spoke more than was his custom, sharing observations from his journey that went beyond mere practical reporting. He described landscape changes visible from the Ridge Trail, mentioned conversations with military officers that revealed Eastern political developments, and even recounted an amusing incident involving a young lieutenant's first encounter with Western Trail conditions. Margaret, in turn, provided a detailed account of ranch happenings during his absence. Emma's developing patterns, household improvements she'd implemented, and observations about approaching winter weather signs. It wasn't the animated conversation of intimate friends, but rather the thoughtful exchange of partners in a shared enterprise, each with valuable perspective to contribute. After the meal, as Margaret cleared dishes, Reed remained at the table, with Emma cradled in one arm, his expression contemplative. "Winter comes early at this elevation," he said abruptly. "First, heavy snow, usually by mid-October." "So soon?" Margaret glanced toward the window, where golden leaves still clung to cottonwoods along the creek. "The weather seems so mild still. Changes fast in the mountains. Need to be prepared." Reed hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Your arrangement here was temporary. Understanding was you'd earn money to return east when possible." The statement hung between them, its implications momentous. Margaret set the dishes aside and returned to the table, her heart suddenly racing. "That was the initial understanding," she confirmed carefully. "Winter travel's difficult," Reed continued, his gaze fixed on Emma rather than meeting Margaret's eyes. "Dangerous even. Stage routes close with heavy snow. Trail to Pine Creek gets impassable." Margaret waited, sensing there was more to this practical warning than weather information. "Would make sense for you to stay through spring," Reed finally said. "For Emma's sake, safer that way." The ostensible reason, concern for infant safety during winter travel, hardly concealed the true request. Reed was asking her to remain at Broken Pine, extending their arrangement beyond the temporary agreement to a more substantial commitment. "And after spring?" Margaret asked, needing clarity despite the risk of pressing too far. Reed's hands shifted slightly where they supported Emma, his only outward sign of discomfort with the conversation's personal territory. Decision would be yours then, whether to stay or go. The offer reflected Reed's character, straightforward, practical, without emotional embellishment. Yet Margaret recognized the significant trust it represented. He was inviting her to remain as Emma's caretaker and his housekeeper indefinitely, offering security in exchange for continued service. "I would be happy to remain through winter," she said carefully. "Emma deserves stability, and travel would indeed be foolish in such conditions." Relief flickered briefly across Reed's stoic features before his customary reserve reasserted itself. He nodded once, the matter settled in his mind, then rose to hand Emma to Margaret. "Need to check on a mare about to foal," he said, reverting to practical matters now that the uncomfortable personal business was concluded. "Jimmy reports she's restless." After Reed's departure, Margaret sat in the kitchen rocker with Emma drowsing against her shoulder, considering the implications of their exchange. Her position at Broken Pine had just shifted from temporary expedient to something more enduring. Not permanence exactly, but a commitment measured in seasons rather than weeks. The arrangement offered immediate security and purpose, yet left her future path undefined. Come spring, when weather permitted travel, she would face the choice Reed had acknowledged: remain at Broken Pine in her current capacity or seek opportunities elsewhere. By then, she would have sufficient saved wages to fund travel if she chose to leave. Emma stirred against her shoulder, tiny fingers clutching at Margaret's collar. The attachment forming between them complicated matters beyond practical considerations. The infant was thriving under their shared care, establishing bonds that would only deepen through the isolated winter months ahead. Whatever Margaret decided in spring would affect not just her own future, but Emma's as well. The responsibility weighed heavily, yet carried a sweetness she hadn't anticipated when accepting employment at Broken Pine. The following weeks brought increasing evidence of Reed's prediction about mountain weather. Overnight temperatures dropped steadily. Morning, frost outlined meadow grasses in silver, and the first snow-dusted higher elevations visible from the ranch house. Preparations for winter consumed everyone at Broken Pine. Cattle driven to lower pastures, hay stored in barns, firewood stacked along the house's sheltered side. Margaret's domestic preparations proceeded with equal intensity. Under Reed's authorization, Frank Morgan transported her to Pine Creek for substantial provisioning: flour, sugar, coffee, dried fruits, medicinal supplies, and fabric for winter clothing. The town appeared marginally more active than during her initial visit, with several previously shuttered buildings showing signs of renovation. "Mining companies serious about reopening," Morgan commented as they loaded supplies. "Brought in engineers from Denver, talking about modern equipment, safer tunnels." The news stirred mixed emotions for Margaret. Pine Creek's potential revival might eventually offer additional options, yet she found herself oddly uninterested in alternatives to her current situation. Broken Pine had become more than mere employment. It now represented a place where her contributions were valued, where she had forged connections that transcended financial arrangement. Reed himself had begun to consciously include Margaret in broader ranch decisions, not just household matters. He consulted her about cattle sales timing, shared correspondence regarding beef prices, and even sought her opinion on improvements to the bunkhouse before winter confined the hands to close quarters during storms. "Men respect your judgment," he explained, when she expressed surprise at being asked about bunkhouse arrangements. "Frank says you've got a good head for practical matters. The approval warmed her more than practical stove heat ever could. In Philadelphia, Margaret's intelligence had been acceptable within narrow confines, appropriate for music instruction or household management, but never sought for substantive business matters. Reed's matter-of-fact inclusion of her perspective represented a form of respect she hadn't previously experienced. Emma's development provided another source of quiet joy during these autumn weeks. The orphaned infant grew sturdy and responsive, learning to focus on faces, to track movement with increasing accuracy, to communicate needs with distinctive cries that Margaret was learning to interpret. Reed spent time with her each evening, his initial awkwardness yielding to genuine attachment as Emma began responding to his deep voice with apparent recognition. "She'll need proper documentation," Reed announced one evening as they sat by the fire, Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "For her future security." Margaret looked up from her mending, catching his meaning immediately. "You're considering formal adoption?" Reed nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. Reverend Morris provided her birth details. Parents were Sean and Catherine Tucker, married 3 years, no known relatives seeking custody. The information answered questions Margaret had included in her letter to the minister. Emma would grow up knowing her origins while being secure, in her place at Broken Pine, assuming Reed proceeded with legal adoption. "It's a significant responsibility," Margaret observed, watching his reaction carefully. "Raising a daughter alone." Reed's grey eyes lifted to meet hers directly, a rare occurrence that emphasized the moment's importance. "Not alone," he said, quietly. "Not if you stay." The simple statement contained layers of meaning Margaret wasn't prepared to fully examine. Reed wasn't proposing anything beyond their current arrangement, yet he was acknowledging its evolution into something more consequential than employer and employee. A partnership in Emma's upbringing that transcended temporary circumstances. "I've already agreed to remain through winter," she reminded him carefully. "Spring isn't far after that," Reed replied, returning his gaze to the fire. "Decision will need making then." The conversation lapsed into thoughtful silence, yet something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of shared purpose that went beyond practical household management. Emma's future had become a bond connecting them, requiring eventual decisions neither was ready to articulate fully. October arrived with the first significant snowfall, transforming Broken Pine overnight. Margaret woke to a world rendered in white and shadow, familiar landscape features softened into unrecognizable shapes, the morning sun creating diamond brilliance across unmarked expanses. Emma, now nestled in a proper crib Reed had constructed as she outgrew the cradle, stirred and cooed at the unusual light filtering through curtains. Margaret carried her to the window, holding her where she could see the transformed world. "Your first snow, little one," she murmured against Emma's dark curls. "The first of many Wyoming winters you'll know." The casual promise in her words caught Margaret by surprise. She had spoken as if her presence in Emma's future winters was assured, as if Broken Pine represented home rather than temporary shelter. The realization was both unsettling and strangely comforting, evidence of emotional attachment forming. Despite her careful pragmatism, from the window she could see Reed and the hands already creating paths between buildings, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they shoveled snow with practiced efficiency. The scene epitomized the reality of ranch life. Beauty and hardship inextricably linked, survival requiring constant effort regardless of circumstances. Yet watching Reed methodically clearing paths to the barn, his movements powerful and purposeful. In the morning light, Margaret found herself admiring more than practical frontier resilience. The man himself had begun to occupy her thoughts in ways that extended beyond their working relationship. His quiet integrity, his unexpected gentleness with Emma, his respect for Margaret's capabilities and judgment. Such awareness was dangerous, she reminded herself firmly. Whatever their arrangement, she remained an employee whose security depended on maintaining professional boundaries. Reed had offered partnership in Emma's care, not personal connection beyond what was necessary for household harmony. Emma patted Margaret's face with tiny fingers, demanding attention in her increasingly assertive way. "Yes, my love," Margaret murmured, turning from the window and her unsettling thoughts. "Breakfast for us both, and then we'll greet your winter world properly." The day proceeded with normal routine despite the snowfall. Meals prepared, household tasks completed. Emma tended between other responsibilities. Reed's prediction about winter's impact proved immediately accurate, as the temperature continued dropping throughout the day, forcing everyone indoors by late afternoon as bitter wind swept down from the mountains. That evening, with snow still falling and wind creating eerie harmonics in the chimney, Reed carried in additional firewood and placed a box beside Margaret's chair. "Found these in storage," he said simply. "Thought they might be useful." Inside lay tiny garments of soft wool, gowns, caps, blankets and leggings, sized for an infant through various stages of growth. Ellen Reed's baby clothes, preserved for the child who never arrived, now offered for Emma's comfort through the Wyoming winter. The gesture struck Margaret with unexpected force. Not just practical provision, but symbolic acceptance of their unconventional household, their shared care. Of an orphaned child whose future they were both increasingly invested in securing. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than her emotions. "These will keep her warm through the coldest nights." Reed nodded once, acceptance of her gratitude without need for elaboration. As he turned to add wood to the fire, his profile outlined against the flames, Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been carefully avoiding. Her interest in Daniel Reed had grown beyond respect for an employer or appreciation of his kindness toward Emma. The realization complicated everything. About her position at Broken Pine, spring would bring decisions more complex than she had initially anticipated, choices that would determine not just her location, but the shape of her heart's future as well. The first major blizzard of the season struck Broken Pine in early November, arriving with a ferocity that transformed the picturesque snowfall of October into something altogether more threatening. Margaret woke to the howl of wind, finding every crevice in the log walls, rattling windows, and sending drafts chasing across the wooden floors, despite Reed's careful weatherproofing. Emma, now sleeping through most nights, stirred restlessly in. Her crib, perhaps sensing the storm's wild energy, Margaret lifted her, murmuring reassurances as she wrapped the infant in one of Ellen's woolen blankets. The house felt unnaturally cold, despite banked fires left burning overnight in both the kitchen stove and main room fireplace. Descending the stairs with Emma clutched close to her chest, Margaret found Reed already stoking the main fireplace. To blazing life, his expression held the focused concentration she had come to recognize as concern rather than anger. "Bad one," he said by way of greeting. "Temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. Wind from the north bringing more snow. Need to move cattle to the sheltered ravine." Margaret nodded, recognizing both the concern and the practicalities that demanded immediate attention, regardless of weather. "Emma and I will manage here. What do the men need for the day?" Reed's expression softened marginally at her immediate understanding. "Hot food now, provisions they can carry. Frank's checking stock in the south pasture. Jimmy and Will are preparing rope lines between buildings." The rope lines were a precaution Margaret had learned about from Ellen's household journal. Guidelines strung between ranch buildings during blizzards when visibility could drop to arm's length, preventing men from becoming disoriented and freezing to death mere yards from safety. "I'll prepare food immediately," she promised, shifting Emma to her other arm, "and keep the fires strong." Reed nodded, already moving toward the kitchen where he began pulling on heavy winter gear. lined coat, wool scarf, fur-lined gloves, and a hat that covered all but his eyes. The transformation was striking, from the Daniel Reed of evening conversations by the fire to a frontier figure prepared to battle elemental forces. "Should be back by nightfall," he said, hesitating at the door. "If we're not—" Margaret met his gaze directly. "I know what to do, Mr. Reed. Emma and I will be fine, and the house will be ready when you return." Something passed between them. In that moment, acknowledgement of shared understanding that transcended words. Recognition that Margaret had integrated into Broken Pine's rhythms so completely that extended explanations were no longer necessary. Reed departed into the howling whiteness, the door closing behind him with an ominous finality. Through the window, Margaret watched his tall figure quickly disappear into the swirling snow, the world beyond the glass reduced to formless white fury. The day stretched endlessly as Margaret maintained her vigil. She kept both fires burning high, prepared hearty stew and fresh bread for the men's return, and established a nest of blankets in the main room where she and Emma could remain warm while conserving firewood in the rest of the house. The piano stood silent, its music inappropriate for a day ruled by wilderness power rather than human endeavor. As afternoon faded toward evening with no sign of Reed or the hands, Margaret consulted Ellen's journal for wisdom. Between household advice and recipes, the earlier Mrs. Reed had recorded practical observations from previous winters. Third day of blizzard, Daniel strung additional rope line to Springhouse. Coldest night, soapstones wrapped in flannel, kept baby Thomas warm while chimney smoke backed into house. When men are delayed, prepare coffee with whiskey addition for immediate warming. Following Ellen's guidance, Margaret placed soapstones from the kitchen hearth into the oven to heat gradually, wrapped flannel around glass bottles filled with hot water, and located the bottle of whiskey Reed kept for medicinal purposes in the kitchen cabinet. When darkness fell completely with still no sign of the men, Margaret forced herself to remain calm. Reed was experienced in mountain weather, the hands knowledgeable about cattle and survival. Worry would serve no practical purpose. Near midnight, as the fire burned low despite Margaret's careful tending, sounds at the back door propelled her. From the chair where she had been dozing with Emma, cradled against her chest, she laid the baby in her makeshift nest of blankets and hurried to unbar the door. Reed entered first, snow crusted on his clothing and beard, his normally composed features haggard with exhaustion. Behind him, Frank Morgan and Will Cooper supported, Jimmy Turner between them, the young cowboy's face alarmingly pale beneath his frost-rimed hat. "Jimmy's foot," Reed explained tersely, helping guide the procession toward the fire. "Found him half buried near the north fence. Been out too long." Margaret immediately recognized the danger, frostbite, potentially severe enough to threaten limb or life. She had read about frontier remedies in Ellen's journal, never expecting to apply them so soon. "Bring him close to the fire," she directed, abandoning deference to take command of the situation. "Not too close. Sudden heat will damage frozen tissue. Will, fetch blankets from the chest upstairs. Frank, help me remove his boots carefully." The men followed her instructions without question, recognizing practical authority regardless of its source. Jimmy remained conscious but confused, his words slurring as Morgan and Reed eased him onto the sofa near the fireplace. Margaret's stomach clenched as they revealed the affected foot. White and bloodless below the ankle, a terrible stillness to the flesh that suggested significant freezing. She remembered Ellen's journal entry. Gradual warming only. Cold water first, then tepid, then warm. Never hot, never rub. "I need basins of water," she instructed. "Cold first, from the pump, and clean cloths." While the men gathered supplies, Margaret checked on Emma, finding the infant still sleeping peacefully despite the commotion. Moving quickly, she prepared the whiskey-laced coffee Ellen had recommended, setting it to heat on the stove before returning to Jimmy's side. The next hours tested Margaret's composure as she had never been tested in Philadelphia drawing rooms. She directed the gradual warming of Jimmy's foot according to Ellen's instructions, monitoring the dangerous transition as circulation painfully returned to frozen tissue. The young cowboy's stoicism crumbled as feeling returned, his face contorting. With pain, he tried manfully to suppress. "Swear if you need to, Jimmy," she told him matter-of-factly, supporting his foot in a basin of barely tepid water. "I've heard worse in Philadelphia concert halls when sopranos missed their high notes." The weak joke startled a chuckle from the suffering man, easing the tension that had gripped the room. Reed, who had been silently observing from beside the fireplace, met Margaret's eyes with what might have been approval in his typically guarded expression. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Jimmy's foot had regained healthy color, except for 2 toes that remained worryingly mottled. He slept now on the sofa, exhaustion claiming him after pain and whiskey had done their work. Frank and Will had retreated to the bunkhouse once the immediate danger passed, leaving Reed and Margaret alone in the kitchen where she prepared fresh coffee. "You handled that well," Reed said quietly, accepting the steaming mug she offered. "Knew exactly what to do." Margaret shook her head, suddenly aware of bone-deep fatigue after the night's vigil. "I followed Ellen's instructions from her journal. She recorded everything, remedies, warnings, experiences. It was her knowledge, not mine. You found it, applied it correctly, made decisive choices." Reed studied her over the rim of his mug. "That's more than knowledge. That's wisdom." The unexpected praise warmed Margaret more effectively than the coffee. Reed rarely offered direct compliments, making this acknowledgement particularly meaningful after the harrowing night. "Will Jimmy recover completely?" she asked, glancing toward the main room, where the young cowboy's snores provided reassuring evidence of life and resilience. Reed's expression sobered. "Might lose the small toes. Dr. Jenkins can tell better when he can travel from Pine Creek." He took another sip of coffee before adding, "Without your intervention, would have lost the foot, maybe more." The blunt assessment highlighted the frontier reality they inhabited. Medical care days away, survival dependent on practical knowledge and decisive action. Margaret had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking, demonstrating capability. During genuine crisis rather than mere household competence. "You should rest," Reed said, setting down his empty mug. "Been up all night. I'll watch Emma." The offer reflected growing ease with their shared responsibility for the infant, who had graduated from the Tucker baby to Emma in Reed's speech, a subtle acknowledgement of deepening attachment. Margaret accepted gratefully, her body suddenly leaden with exhaustion now that immediate danger had passed. She slept deeply despite the continued howl of wind around the eaves, waking in late afternoon to find the house quiet except for low voices from the main room. Disoriented momentarily, she rose and straightened her rumpled clothing before descending the stairs. The scene that greeted her melted something long frozen in her chest. Reed sat in the armchair before the fire, Emma cradled in one arm while he read aloud from a leather-bound book of poetry. Jimmy remained asleep on the sofa. Color returned to his face, a healthy flush replacing the alarming pallor of the previous night. Reed looked up as she entered, his reading pausing mid-verse. In the firelight, with his guard momentarily lowered, Margaret glimpsed the man who might have existed before grief hardened his features, younger somehow, with softness around his eyes that transformed his entire countenance. "She was fussing," he explained, setting the book aside. "Poetry settled her." "Tennyson?" Margaret asked, recognizing the volume from the bookshelf. Reed nodded, something like embarrassment flashing across his features. "Ellen's favorite. Used to read it in the evenings. The simple statement revealed another layer to this complex man, not just the capable rancher who battled blizzards and managed cattle operations, but someone who remembered his wife's literary preferences, who read poetry to soothe an infant, who recognized beauty alongside practicality. "You've had no sleep yourself," Margaret observed, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "I can take Emma now." Reed surrendered the baby with evident reluctance, his hands lingering briefly as they transferred her small weight between them. "Storms. Letting up," he reported. "Frank and Will are checking stock casualties. Could have been worse." The terse report contained worlds of relief. Animals saved, men surviving, damage limited by preparation and swift response. Margaret recognized the unspoken acknowledgement of shared victory against elemental forces that threatened their survival. "Jimmy's foot?" she asked, glancing toward the sleeping cowboy. "Better than expected. Toes have good color now. Might keep them all." The blizzard marked a turning point in Margaret's role at Broken Pine. The household dynamic shifted subtly following her decisive handling of Jimmy's injury. Frank and Will now sought her opinion on matters beyond cooking. Reed included her in discussions about winter management of diminishing supplies, and even Jimmy, once recovered enough to return to limited duties, treated her with a respect that transcended polite deference to the housewoman. December arrived, with alternating periods of relative calm and renewed snowstorms. The ranch settled into winter rhythms, limited outdoor activity focused on animal care and firewood management, increased indoor pursuits during long evenings when darkness fell. By mid-afternoon, Margaret established routines that incorporated frontier practicalities she would never have imagined in Philadelphia, rendering tallow for candles when store-bought supplies ran low, preserving precious coffee beans by mixing them with roasted barley, repurposing worn clothing into braided rugs that provided additional insulation on wooden floors. Emma thrived despite the harsh conditions, growing plump on goat's milk, supplemented with thin cereals as Margaret gradually introduced solid foods. Her personality emerged more distinctly with each passing week, determined, observant, quick to smile at familiar faces, but watchful with strangers when occasional visitors braved the trails between isolated ranches. Reed, to Margaret's continuing surprise, proved to be Emma's most dedicated advocate. He fashioned toys from scraps of wood, carving them during evening hours when ranch work was complete. A rattle with smooth pine balls contained in a hollow cylinder, a teething ring of polished hardwood, small animals with remarkably lifelike details. He spoke to her with adult seriousness, explaining cattle breeding theories or weather patterns, while she listened with solemn attention that sometimes dissolved into delighted giggles when he tickled her gently. "She's intelligent," he observed. One evening, as Emma concentrated on grasping a wooden block he had carved with raised letters. "Notices everything." Margaret nodded agreement, having observed the same focused curiosity herself. "She'll be reading early, I expect. She already recognizes when I pick up specific books for her bedtime stories." Reed seemed pleased by this assessment, as if Emma's potential intelligence reflected well on his decision to adopt her rather than send her to the Denver orphanage. The formal adoption process had begun, with papers filed through Reverend Morris, who had connections to the territorial judiciary. By spring, according to the minister's latest letter, Emma would legally be Emma Reed, with all rights of inheritance and protection such status conveyed. The impending formalization of Emma's position at Broken Pine highlighted the ambiguity of Margaret's own situation. Though Reed had ceased referring to her potential departure come spring, the unspoken question remained: would she continue as Emma's caretaker and Reed's housekeeper indefinitely, or seek other opportunities once weather-permitted travel? Financial considerations no longer dictated her decision. Reed had been more than fair with her wages, which accumulated largely unspent due to winter isolation. She could afford passage to Denver or even back east if she chose that path. Practical security no longer provided adequate justification for remaining at Broken Pine. The truth, which Margaret acknowledged only in the privacy of her thoughts, was that emotional connections now bound her to this place, to Emma, whose care had become deeply rewarding, to the rhythms of ranch life which suited her organizational nature despite its hardships, and to Daniel Reed himself, whose quiet integrity and unexpected depths had awakened feelings she had never anticipated when accepting his offer of employment. Christmas approached, bringing bittersweet awareness of their unusual household circumstances. In Philadelphia, Margaret had observed the holiday with proper church attendance and formal social gatherings. At Broken Pine, deep snow made travel to Pine Creek's small church impossible, and social obligations were limited to the ranch hands, who had nowhere else to go during winter's isolation. "Never made much of Christmas since Ellen and Thomas passed," Reed admitted when Margaret inquired about ranch traditions. "Men exchange small gifts, cook something special if supplies allow." The subdued approach reflected both frontier practicality and personal grief, but Margaret found herself unwilling to let the holiday pass unmarked, particularly with Emma experiencing her first Christmas. Consultations with Ellen's journal revealed that the previous Mrs. Reed had maintained certain traditions: greenery brought indoors, special cookies from her mother's German recipe, small handmade gifts for ranch hands, and music on Christmas Eve. "Would you object if I attempted to revive some of these customs?" Margaret asked Reed, showing him the journal entries. "Not to replace your way of observing the day, but perhaps to complement it." She watched uncertainty flicker across his features, wondering if she had pressed too far into painful territory. After a moment, Reed nodded slowly. Ellen would have wanted it, especially with Emma here now. Permission granted, Margaret set about creating a frontier Christmas with available materials. Pine boughs from nearby trees provided greenery for the mantelpiece and table. Flour and sugar reserves, carefully rationed, yielded traditional Lebkuchen according to Ellen's recipe. Fabric scraps became simple gifts: a patchwork cushion for Frank's bunk, hand-sewn mittens for Jimmy, a quilted page marker for Will, who read voraciously during winter evenings. For Reed, she hesitated longest. What could she offer this self-sufficient man that wouldn't seem presumptuous or inadequate? Inspiration came from an unexpected source. Ellen's work basket contained half-finished embroidery, a handkerchief with pine branches partially rendered in green thread. Margaret completed the design, adding tiny red berries and Reed's initials in one corner, hoping the gesture would be received as respect for both past and present rather than inappropriate familiarity. For Emma, Margaret sacrificed one of her few remaining Philadelphia possessions, a small silver locket that had been her mother's, its chain shortened to fit a child, though Emma would not wear it for years to come. Inside, she placed a tiny cutting of the infant's dark hair, preserving this moment of her life for future remembrance. Christmas Eve arrived clear and bitterly cold, stars brilliant above snow-covered mountains visible through frost-etched windows. The ranch hands joined them in the main house for dinner, bringing their own contributions: Will's skillfully carved nativity figures, Jimmy's harmonica for music, Frank's store of tales about Christmases past when his own children were small. After dinner, at Frank's urging, Margaret played carols on the piano, while Jimmy accompanied on harmonica, creating imperfect but joyful music that filled the house with festive sounds. Emma, dressed in a gown Margaret had fashioned from one of her own petticoats with red ribbon trim, watched the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination from Reed's protective arms. When the hands eventually departed for the bunkhouse carrying cookies wrapped in cloth and their small gifts, the main house settled into peaceful quiet. Emma had fallen asleep against Reed's shoulder, her small face relaxed in complete security. "She should have this always," Reed said quietly, as Margaret banked the fire for the night. Family, traditions, security. The simple statement carried implications Margaret wasn't certain how to interpret. Was Reed merely expressing his commitment to Emma's well-being, or suggesting something more about the household they had created together? She will, Margaret replied carefully. You've ensured that by choosing to raise her yourself rather than sending her to Denver. Reed's gaze remained on the sleeping child, his weathered hand gently supporting her head with surprising tenderness. One person isn't enough for proper raising, he said finally. Children need more. The halting words contained a vulnerability Margaret had rarely witnessed in this self-contained man. She waited, sensing he had more to say but needed time to find the words. Been thinking, Reed continued, his voice low to avoid waking Emma, about spring, your decision. Margaret's heart quickened despite her efforts at composure. Yes, could make a different arrangement. Reed finally looked up, meeting her eyes directly. More permanent, for Emma's sake, and he hesitated, then finished with uncharacteristic openness. For mine. The proposal for that was unmistakably what Reed was offering, hung in the Christmas Eve silence between them. Not a romantic declaration or passionate plea, but something perhaps more honest, recognition of mutual respect and shared purpose that had gradually evolved into deeper attachment. Margaret found herself unable to respond immediately, overwhelmed by the implications of this frontier proposal from a man who had lost so much and guarded himself so carefully. Reed waited, his expression revealing more vulnerability than she had ever witnessed in their months together. Before she could formulate a response, Emma stirred against Reed's shoulder, small hands clutching at his shirt as she shifted in sleep. The moment suspended between them, a question asked but not yet answered, potential futures hanging in the balance as the Wyoming winter night deepened around Broken Pine Ranch. Margaret awoke Christmas morning to find the world transformed by overnight snowfall. Pristine white blanketed the ranch yard, drifts curving in graceful waves against buildings and fences. The beauty momentarily distracted her from the weighty question that had remained unanswered the previous night. Reed's careful proposal, more permanent arrangement, had caught her entirely unprepared. The interruption of Emma's stirring had provided welcome reprieve, allowing Margaret to retreat upstairs with the drowsy infant rather than formulate an immediate response to a question that would determine all their futures. Now, in the clear light of morning, she considered the man who had offered her a place not just in his household, but in his life. Daniel Reed was not William Fletcher with false promises and deceptive charm. He was a man whose actions consistently revealed his character, rescuing an orphaned infant when others saw only burden, offering employment to a stranded woman when others saw only liability, respecting her capabilities when previous suitors had deemed her too opinionated. The marriage he proposed would be founded on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic passion. While not the love match young Margaret had once dreamed of in Philadelphia parlors, it offered something perhaps more enduring: partnership with a man of integrity who valued her precisely for the qualities others had rejected. And there was Emma, sleeping peacefully in her crib, unaware that Margaret's decision would shape her future as profoundly as Reed's choice to adopt her. The attachment between them had deepened beyond professional obligation into genuine love. The thought of leaving her come spring had become increasingly painful to contemplate. Margaret dressed with particular care, selecting her best dress, a deep blue wool that Ellen's sewing supplies had allowed her to alter for better fit. Whatever her answer to Reed's proposal, the day deserved proper observance. Downstairs, she found Reed already tending the fires, his expression carefully neutral as he greeted her. No mention was made of the previous night's conversation as they prepared breakfast and exchanged simple gifts with the hands who arrived bearing additional venison from a Christmas Eve hunt. Only when the household had settled into afternoon quiet, Emma napping in her crib upstairs and the hands returned to the bunkhouse with full stomachs, did Reed approach the subject directly. "About last night," he began, standing before the fireplace with uncharacteristic restlessness. "Spoke too suddenly. Should have prepared better words." Margaret set aside her mending, giving the moment her full attention. "Your words were honest, Mr. Reed. That holds more value than prepared speeches." He nodded once, accepting this perspective. Still, a woman deserves proper asking. He crossed to the bookshelf, returning with a small wooden box Margaret hadn't seen before. This was Ellen's, been keeping it for someone worthy. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small diamond flanked by tiny emeralds. Not an extravagant piece by Eastern standards, but undoubtedly precious in this frontier setting. "Margaret Harlow," Reed said formally, her name sounding different in his deep voice, "would do me the honor of becoming my wife, partner in raising Emma, mistress of Broken Pine." The directness of the proposal matched the man himself. Straightforward, without embellishment, yet containing profound commitment. Margaret found herself deeply moved by its simple sincerity. "I should tell you," she began carefully, "that I came west seeking security after my father's death left me in difficult circumstances. My agreement to marry William Fletcher was largely practical rather than romantic." Reed nodded, unsurprised by this admission. "Most mail-order arrangements are. Doesn't make them less worthy if built on honest understanding. And now you offer a similar arrangement," Margaret continued, "yet it seems different in fundamental ways." "Is different," Reed confirmed. "Know you now. Your character, your capabilities, not asking strangers for letters." The distinction was profound. Reed wasn't seeking a generic wife to perform household duties. He was asking specifically for Margaret Harlow, with full knowledge of her personality, opinions, and abilities. "There's Emma to consider," Margaret said, though the infant's welfare actually clarified her decision rather than complicating it. "She deserves stability. Deserves a mother who values her mind," Reed added quietly. "Father who respects her mother." The simple statement crystallized everything for Margaret. Whatever traditional romance might be lacking in their arrangement, Reed offered something far rarer: genuine respect, appreciation for her whole self rather than merely her domestic capabilities. He wanted her as partner and co-parent, recognizing Emma would learn from their example what to expect in her own future relationships. "I accept your proposal," Margaret said with quiet certainty. "Not from necessity or lack of options, but because I believe we can build something worthwhile together." Reed's expression transformed, relief and something warmer softening his weathered features. He took her hand carefully, as if handling something precious, and slipped Ellen's ring onto her finger. It fit nearly perfectly, another small sign of rightness in their unconventional journey. "Won't regret it," he promised, the words simple, but carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Margaret smiled, her first truly unfettered smile since arriving in Wyoming territory. "I believe you, Daniel." His given name felt natural on her lips, marking the transition from employer and employee to future husband and wife. Their wedding took place in early February, when a temporary thaw made the trail to Pine Creek passable. Reverend Morris performed the ceremony in the small church, with Frank Morgan standing as witness and Jimmy Turner holding Emma, now nearly 6 months old, and regarding the proceedings with solemn attention. The Pine Creek community turned out in surprising numbers. Curiosity about the Eastern mail-order bride, who had found unexpected placement at Broken Pine, bringing even barely acquainted miners and shopkeepers to witness the event. Margaret recognized Faces from her brief stay at the boarding house, including Mrs. Harvey, who approached after the ceremony with uncharacteristic warmth. "Knew you had steel in your spine when Fletcher abandoned you," the older woman declared approvingly. "Reed's a good man who needed someone with backbone. Well matched, the pair of you." The assessment, while lacking in traditional romantic sentiment, struck Margaret as high praise indeed from this practical frontier woman. She accepted it with genuine gratitude. After the brief reception at the church, Reed surprised Margaret with a visit to the mercantile, where he had ordered a special gift. A lap desk with compartments for writing materials, precisely the sort she had mentioned missing from her Philadelphia possessions. "For letters and accounts," he explained, "and poetry if you're inclined. Everyone needs space for their own thoughts." The thoughtfulness of the gift, recognizing her intellectual needs, rather than focusing solely on practical household items, confirmed yet again the wisdom of her decision. Daniel Reed saw her completely, valuing mind alongside domestic capabilities. Their return to Broken Pine as husband and wife marked subtle but significant changes to household routines. Reed moved Margaret's belongings to the master bedroom at the end of the hall, placing Emma's crib nearby. He consulted her on cattle purchases and breeding decisions, not merely as courtesy, but with genuine interest in her analytical perspective. Together, they drafted plans for spring improvements to the ranch. A proper garden plot, with protective fencing against deer, expansion of the kitchen's cold storage, additional fruit trees along the creek. As March arrived with hints of approaching spring, Margaret found herself contemplating the journey that had brought her to this unexpected happiness. William Fletcher's cruel abandonment, initially devastating, had opened the path to Broken Pine. Without that seeming catastrophe, she would never have found her place in this remote valley with a taciturn rancher and orphaned infant who had become her family in every meaningful sense. One evening, a snowmelt trickled from eaves and the first birdsongs of spring filtered through partly opened windows. Daniel joined Margaret on the porch, where she sat with Emma bundled against the lingering chill. "Received letter today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "From Pine Creek Bank." Margaret looked up with interest. The bank had new management since Edmund Clark's departure under a financial cloud, but still represented the nearest financial institution to Broken Pine. "William Fletcher's. Been arrested in Denver," Daniel continued. "Fraud charges from multiple territories. Authorities found letters to other women, same as yours, taking statements from victims." The news struck Margaret with less impact than she might once have expected. Fletcher seemed a distant figure now, his deception painful in retrospect, but no longer defining her present reality. "Should I provide a statement?" she asked practically. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Your choice. Man's facing prison regardless." Margaret considered briefly, then shook her head. "I see no purpose in revisiting that chapter. My life has moved forward in ways he couldn't possibly have anticipated or damaged." Daniel's expression softened as he reached for Emma, who came to him willingly with a delighted smile that revealed her first emerging tooth. "Made our family possible," he observed quietly. "His worst deed led to our best outcome." The philosophical perspective was characteristic of this thoughtful man who had gradually revealed depths beneath his reserved exterior. Margaret reached for his free hand, their fingers intertwining with comfortable familiarity. Below them, the valley showed first signs of spring's approach, patches of earth emerging from melting snow, the creek running fuller with mountain runoff, early wildflowers pushing through in sheltered spots. Broken Pine would soon enter its season of renewal and growth, the cattle operations expanding under Daniel's careful management, the household thriving with Margaret's organized oversight. Emma, secure in the arms of the father who had chosen her and the mother who had found her through circuitous fate, represented their shared future, a child who would grow up knowing her origins but never doubting her place in this family, forged through choice rather than circumstance, as Twilight. Settled over the Wyoming Valley, Margaret Harlow Reed contemplated the journey from abandoned mail-order bride to beloved wife and mother. What had begun as desperate seeking of security had transformed into something far more profound, a partnership founded on mutual respect, strengthened through shared challenges, and now flourishing into genuine love. The Eastern music teacher and the taciturn rancher had found in each other not what they had initially sought, but what they truly needed. Recognition of their complete selves, acceptance of past losses without being defined by them, and the courage to build something new from broken expectations. Together they had created at Broken Pine what neither could have established alone, not merely a functioning household or prosperous ranch, but a genuine home where all three members of their unconventional family could flourish in the uncertain but promising future stretching before them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.